Ti risulta attivata? Sì.
Sì, risulta attivata.
Perfetto.
Avviata da Greta Allegretti. Poi io quando spengo la registra da solo, la
Sì,
chiude.
l'altra volta si è staccata, cioè l'ho trovata subito praticamente, quindi non so se l'ha
Ok,
disattivata qualcuno, se oppure quando escono tutti comunque si spegne, quindi...
ok, perfetto.
Ma in caso poi la taglio io, non è un problema.
So guys, as I was saying to Greta, I would just wait a couple of minutes more to see if other participants will come and will join us, and then we can start. Anyway, as usual, this tutoring will be recorded, so in case the people that can't take part in this presentation can use it afterwards and can listen to it. So we can give a couple of minutes more before starting. Well, okay, I think that the number of 25 is a kind of stuck. So probably we can start and the other one will join afterwards. So let's share the presentation and that's it. I hope you all can see our presentation. And can anybody confirm me that you can see the presentation and you can hear me properly?
Non è a schermo intero però.
Ah, no, ok. Ah, ok. So, grazie Greta. Adesso va bene?
Sì, prova a scorrere una slide. Perfetto, benissimo.
Ok, grazie mille Greta.
Di nulla, buon tutoring.
Okay, thank you so much, Greta. So, guys, today's tutoring is a little bit more conceptual than the previous one. I'm going to spend some time on some on some slides. So when you're going to have the recording of the presentation, you can read it, sorry, because actually today I'll try not to read too much just to avoid the problem of complexity and also not to be too boring. So I think we can start for this second tutoring. And today we're going to speak about Adrian's and the principles and the rules that lies behind the needs and the design process of Villa Adriana, and a very important comparison between a couple of interventions. Adrian and his architects, 19th century of interference between archaeological landscape and hypotactic structure. Okay, the part of this lecture has been presented during an international congress 3 years ago. And basically, this is what we're gonna talk about. In fact, you can see two maps and two coins. On the upper part of the slide, you can see the coin of Adrian, the emperor, that led Villa Adriana to be built. Villa Adriana, the place where you're going to spend a couple of weeks during the Premio Piranesi. And underneath you can see the coin presenting the Emperor Nero with the map, an ancient map of Rome, and underlined in red color, you can see the area that the Nero's villa, that used to be called Domus Aurea, that is Golden House, the space that this Golden House used to occupy inside Rome, a very huge space. Our point is to try to understand and to begin to understand how many connections there will be between the two settlements. Basically, the biggest difference is in the position. In fact, Nero's villa was insisting inside the heart of the city of Rome. And afterwards, after his dismission, became mainly part of the substructures on which new important buildings has been built afterwards. While Villa Adriana has been built completely outside the city of Rome. In fact, it is in Tivoli that at that time was basically countryside. So mainly, this is the biggest difference. Obviously, Nero couldn't have seen Villa Adriana because Nero was emperor between the 54 and the 68 after Christ, while Hadrian's arrived a kind of 70 years after. In fact, he was emperor between 117 and 138 after Christ, so 70 years later than that. But as you could have seen from the map on the bottom side of the slide, for example, the big structure that now is occupied by the Colosseum before was a large structure that used to be occupied by an amazing pond, Lacus. On the other hand, we don't even know if Nero, and mainly his own architects, that was Severo and Celere, used to have all the knowledge that the architects that used to work for Hadrian's would have used afterwards designing Villa Adriana. This is quite strange because there are some connection that seems to connect the two elements in a way that strangely keeps them together. And both of them are not that common for the Roman way of designing big settlements all over the city. And the big one is the fact that the connection of the different elements inside both those two settlements are paratactic and not hypotactic. That means that the connection between the single elements of all the settlements are on the same level instead of being related on a hierarchical situation. You will understood this better lately. In fact, here you can see the center of Rome, and here you can see the situation, two possible reconstruction of how the villa from Nero's used to occupy the space in Rome. Here you can see in the two reconstruction, in the two images in the lower part of the slide, that square pond. That square pond is exactly the place where, at the moment, it has been built the Colosseum. The Colosseum, after the the death of Nero in the 68 after Christ, was built 10 years after, exactly on the same place of the Nero's pond, mainly to try to erase the memory of this emperor in the mind of the peoples from Rome. So, all of those elements that used to compose the villa of Nero in Rome seems to work in a very paratactical way, that is, as I told you, in a way on the same level between all of them, insisting on the landscape of Rome in a position of absolute autonomy, without a position of absolute autonomy and perspective hierarchy. So there were not perspective hierarchy in those kind of situation. And even the way the Nero's villa used to insist inside the center of Rome didn't check that much with the already presence of the former presence of the Forum of Caesar and the forums of Augustus. Yeah, you can see the image is better. This one is the pond I told you about that now is occupied by the Colosseum. This is the Opium hillside. And here you can see from another point of view with another possible reconstruction. This is the Opium hill. And here you can see the rest of the city of Rome. Let me read at the moment. As I told you, we don't know if the architects of Nero used to know all the things that the architects of Hadrian used for Villa Adriana. And those knowledge came mainly from previous architecture all over the world, and mainly from Egypt and from Greece. Here you can see a couple of images of Philae Island, close to Aswan, and Thebe. Here you can see some incredible images from the Description de l'Egypte, that is a book designed by the architects and the archaeologists of Napoleon when they visited Egypt. And here you can see instead Villa Adriana. The approach to Villa Adriana conceived some idea according to the model of the two famous acropolis of the ancient world, the one of Athens and, above all, the one in Pergamon, the actual part of Turkey. In all of the cases, there's a theater as the beginning, starting point of the pathway that drives the people inside the settlement, and a big presence of Templar elements and a large stoa that constitute the elements of monumental and secular importance that mark the access to the urbs in rure, which is the Adrianic villa. What does urbs in rure means? Urbs in rure is a Latin sentence that tries to symbolize the concept of a city in the countryyard. In fact, while the villa of Nero was a kind of countryyard installed inside the city of Rome, the villa of Hadrian is a kind of new city installed in the courtyard. This is the main relationship, but all of them are connected by similar reason of the different complex connected one to each other. You can already see from this image how all the main pavilions of Villa Adriana are somehow connected on a paratactic way. All of them are on the same level of hierarchy. There's not a dominant one that rule the position of other elements. All the elements seems to be on the same hierarchical level. Thus, the complex of the so-called Pantanello at the beginning of the villa, the one that is signed by the Greek theater, you can see the one that I'm signing with my arrow, constitute the entrance to the villa within the temple of Venus Cnidia. So this theater and this temple used to be the entrance of the villa somehow, together with the large access from the portico constituted by the Pesile. So as I told you before, as I read before, a theater, some Templar elements, and a large stoa. The theater, Templar elements, and a large stoa. Those elements reproduce the syntactic sequence of the theater temple portico present at the slope of the sacred rock, both in Athens and in Pergamon. So, as I told you, Villa Adriana took inspiration from the Acropolis that you can see in Athens and the Acropolis that you can see in Pergamon. In fact, all of those three settlements, Villa Adriana, Acropolis of Athens, and Acropolis of Pergamon, start with a big theater, a large stoa, and the presence of so many Templar elements. Then, all the orientations of the elements and the boundaries are geometrically managed by an hypotectic polar composition depending on the centralities of different elements. So, after you have a paratactic situation, everything now is decided and managed by an hypotactic polar composition. That is something that I'm going to explain. As you can see, this is the Acropolis of Pergamon. All of the buildings, despite in a very strange way, are designed and oriented according to some polar focus that organizes and manage all of those positions and alignments. Here you can see how all those Templar elements are organized according to this polar central part. This one, this one, this one. And all of them are connected to another polar point. Sorry. The same can be said for the Acropolis of Athens. Here you can see the two theater, a large stoa, let you enter inside a place full of temples, and all of the temples are managed by other kind of composition. Let's go back, move back to the Domus Aurea in Rome, the House of Nero. The Domus Aurea, for its part, presents a similar compositional attitude, but organized on a general paratactic system composed on the basis of discrete and autonomous elements. You can see on the left side of the slide the composition of Domus Aurea, and on the right part of the slide the composition of Villa Adriana. In Domus Aurea, all the elements are autonomous, and so they are paratactic. On Villa Adriana, all the elements are depending on some peculiar point. In this case, the focus point in the center of the pavilion in Piazza d'Oro that manages the organization of the rest of the complex. The landscape component is established as an ordering principle on which all the pavilions overlook. And it is the current valley of the Colosseum that is the unifying element of the composition. We are talking about Domus Aurea. In Tivoli, instead, the organization is labyrinthine, where the sequence of pavilion proposes a paratactic continuum of introverted spaces immersed in the green landscape, but hypotactically dependent on some pivot, on some joints, the most important of which is that of the Nymphaeum of Piazza d'Oro, the one I told you. So, the paratactic continuum that is present both in Domus Aurea in Rome and in Villa Adriana in Tivoli changes in Tivoli according to the hypotactic hierarchy descending on some pivot. In fact, it's possible to proceed indoors moving from the Piazza d'Oro to the Canopus, passing through an intense series of pavilions, including the Imperial Palace, the Courtyard of the Libraries, the Maritime Theatre, the Sala of Philosophy, the Pecile, and the three Esedras, and the thermal bath complexes. All of that without a hierarchical and capillary distribution systems, but according to a sequence of spaces communicating with each other through simple gates. So, different elements connected one to each other with simple gates without a hierarchical distribution system. In Rome, instead, moving back to Domus Aurea, the principle of unification is entrusted to a valley with the natural landscape at the center. This one, this is the valley, and all the elements are related to the valley. In Tivoli, on the other hand, it is entrusted on a plateau with the natural landscape all around that is the result of an impressive earth-moving work. So, Domus Aurea, paratactical composition on a principal axis, this one, paratactical composition on a principal axis. In Villa Adriana, hypotactic composition, polar according to a pivot, this one. I hope you can understand this. This image is pretty clear. In Domus Aurea, you have one axis and all the elements are on the same hierarchical position and all related to the main axis. That is the axis of the Colosseum Valley. In Villa Adriana, the elements are all according a pivotal center in the center of Piazza d'Oro. But the great generative force capable of nourishing and maintaining life of both of the Rus in Urbe, of the countryside in the city, Domus Aurea, and in the city in the countryside, Villa Adriana, is certainly the water in its symbolic appearance of origin of the empire. Just try to think of the constant supply needed for both complexes, characterized by extensive gardens and crops to be irrigated, artificial lakes, nymphaeums, thermal baths, and various settings present in all of sensitive points of the immersed topography of the two imperial domus. But we talked about water even during the last presentation. Domus Aurea in Rome, with his incredible Stadium Neronis, that big pond afterwards replaced by the Colosseum, and the gigantic nymphaeum of the Temple of the Divine Claudius and the thermal bath of Coleoppio. In Tivoli, instead, in Villa Adriana, the great water architectures of the Pesile, the Canopus, and the Maritime Theatre, as well as the 3 thermal complexes. Water used to represent the prestige of the prince in a fully visible and transparent way. Whoever holds the water holds the life, his own and that of the state, and that of the empire. An interruption of the supply flows of the water is absolutely not conceivable. Water must always be present. For this reason, the only chance of keeping the promise of the empire remains the connection with the large urban aqueducts. Both the Domus Aurea and the Villa Adriana were supplied by these water which arise from the clear sources of the Upper Aniene Valley. Also, in this fact of extreme importance due to their very nature, the countryside in the city and the city in the countryside are united by a double-stranded bond and by the same lifeblood. Here you can see the images of some of the most important architects of the history. I don't know if you can recognize them. Probably you can recognize Le Corbusier, probably Louis Kahn, maybe Andrea Palladio, but I don't know if you can recognize Baldassare Peruzzi, Raffaello Sanzio, Apollodoro da Damasco, Michelangelo, or more contemporary one like Alberto Campo Baeza. All of those architects you can see depicted in this image attended Villa Adriana to learn as much as possible from his complexes, his pavilions, and his kind of settlements, and reuse what they learned visiting Villa Adriana for their own project. That is exactly what we would like you to do coming to Villa Adriana and coming to Premio Piranesi. Coming in there, learning from classical ruins, and then repropose your contemporary architecture, like Le Corbusier did, Louis Kahn did, and Campo Baeza is still doing. Here you can see again some plans of Villa Adriana, some part of plans of Villa Adriana. And those are some of the restitution, some of the drawings that has been taken by the pensionnaire of the ancient Prix de Rome attending Villa Adriana, that used Villa Adriana as a gym to try to learn from the ruins. Exactly what we ask you to do. And those are the boards that they could have completed. If you can see, for example, in these 2 boards, on the upper part, you can admire a restitution of the ruins. On the lower part, the same architect producing a project of a proposal of how Villa Adriana could have appeared in the past. So, understanding from the actual ruins how the original architecture could have been. This is understanding the principles of architectural design straight inside. Again, another element. For example, here we can see Piazza d'Oro on the upper part as a ruin, on the lower part as a project. Both of them produced by the same architect. Again, another drawings of the Maritime Theatre, and this is the restitution. And let's come back to our Villa Adriana, the way Villa Adriana appears to us nowadays. Here you can see the villa with this DVG file that you will be given when you're going to be in Villa Adriana with us, on which you can appreciate even more the relationship between the different pavilion and the different elements of the composition, this time even with the contour signing the different height of the different platform. This is again the ancient map. And those are some of the images of the complexes of Villa Adriana, like this one that is the Teatro Marittimo. These are the interiors of Teatro Marittimo. This is the Canopo. This is the Imperial Palace. This is the Grand Thermal Bath. And this is the Pecile. Again, you can still keep on appreciating, like we did last Monday, how important water was both to life and the maintenance of the villa, and both for the architectonic and scenographical needs. This is the big boulevard for the scenographical entrance. This is Piazza d'Oro that used to be covered by water as well. This is the vestibule, so the entrance, the thermal bath, the great thermal bath. Other pieces of the ruins. Again, learning from the ruins how to approach a contemporary architectural project. Big nymphaeum, olives, trees all over, and again the Peciles, the Canopus water channel. Still the Canopus water channel in a vice versa view during the night with the Serapeum, the big nymphaeum at the end, explaining even better how important the scenographical purposes were in Villa Adriana, were and still are over there, despite what once was architecture at the moment is just a ruin. Again, the plans of Villa Adriana, and again, the map, the view from the top. So let's move back to check the formal models of Villa Adriana. The sacred place that Adrians used to acquire as the founding way to develop his settlement in Tivoli. Let's start with the Acropolis of Pergamum. The Acropolis of Pergamum in the actual Turkey has been built by Eumene I between 263 and 241 before Christ, while Hadrian's villa has been built between 117 and 138 after Christ. Here you can see the big theater giving the access to the Acropolis of Pergamum. An aerial view of the ruin, how they appear nowadays, and on the right, the view of the model reproposing a reconstruction of the archaeological site. This is another amazing drawing, again reproposing the reconstruction of the complex. As you can see, it was fully and strongly designed. And also in this view, you can admire how the different elements that can be clearly related in the plan actually are more difficult to be connected because of the slopes and all the difference of height. So what is pretty clear here, the scheme that I already explained to you before, presenting all these connection with the two focal points and the different pavilion, here can be understood and mean even from the other point of view. The second focal point that in this plan can't be seen can be instead clearly understood from this perspective. In fact, the organization of most of the biggest elements of the complex is relating in a hypotactical way according to this little temple in the countryside, in the territory. And this was about the Acropolis of Pergamon. This kind of suggestion has been used by Adrian for the villa in Tivoli. But what about the other example that inspired Adrian's? We are talking about the sanctuary of Isis on the Philae Island. Now we are in Egypt. This sanctuary has been built by Nectanebo the first in 340 before Christ. So even previously than the intervention of the Acropolis of Pergamon. Philae Island was this incredible island pretty close to Aswan. Then that just because of the construction of the Aswan dam has been flooded by the water, because the construction of the dam let the water to rise. And so the complex of the sanctuary insisting on the Philae Island was flooded, as you can admire here in some of the picture from the first half of the last century. In fact, at the moment, what we can visit when we go to see Philae Island actually is not the original Philae Island, because the original Philae Island is completely submerged by water. So what has been done? All of those temples and all of sanctuary, all of those buildings has been disassembled and reassembled on a closer island, an higher one, keeping the same orientation, the same proportion, and the same distances, to repropose the orientation and the overall environment that, because of the dam, would have been flooded otherwise. Again, if we look at the sanctuary on Philae Island, you can see how all the elements of the settlement are organized according to an hypotactic polar system, turning around the central pivotal points that at the moment can't be seen because it's submerged by water. But all of those elements create the composition of a radial system organized according to this pivotal point. Here you can see a closer view. And here we can move back to Villa Adriana to show something clearer. As I told you, the main important pivotal point in Villa Adriana insists in Piazza d'Oro, of which you can see here one photograph. Again, you can see on the left part a survey of Piazza d'Oro, and on the right part a eventual reconstruction of the original complex. In this original complex, you can admire this very complex pavilion with all those rounded shapes that follow one to each other. This element is the crucial one in all the composition of the villa. In fact, this pavilion generates the most important pivotal point of the entire complex in Villa Adriana. Here it is, the situation from the inside. And now I'm going to explain you the differences in a clear way between the classical Roman way of settling, that is an orthogonal grid that rule all the composition, move to a polar radial composition, the one that I tried to explain to you. Here you can see the main difference between those two elements. But this is not enough, because the polar radial composition on its side produce other polar elements that can generate other radial composition in this way. So, as you already saw, you can see how these pivotal elements, for example, organize the direction of this complex, and also the position of this temple, the Venus-Clydia temple, and even the Greek theater. Or you can see how these axes organize the orientation of this complex that otherwise could have been oriented in a different way. We can say the same with the third radius, organizes the three hexaedral complexes, or the fourth radius organizing the orientation of the great thermal bath complex. The fifth radius not only manage the orientation, but also identify the position of 3 points aligned on the same axis. Here you can see the name of the toponymy of the different elements. And here you can see a scheme symbolizing and clarifying the situation. Those are the pictures, the photographs of the elements involved in this system. This is the temple of Venus Cnidia. And as I told you, the first polar organization that find the radius 1, the R1, that found those alignment, start in organizing, for example, the orientation of the maritime theater, or otherwise the orientation of these aqueducts according to this alignment, or these elements. So the original pivotal points focuses another pivotal points. This one, instead of becoming something that is intercept, is something that is now generative. And as you can see, this generation also create a very peculiar architectonic and geometrical elements. In fact, organizing the focal point in Piazza d'Oro, the focal point in Venus Cnidia, all of them, they can meet in the three hexaedras pavilion, creating a triangle with a rectangle 90-degree angles. That is this one. Then other focal point can be assumed in the other way. So the focal point in Piazza d'Oro, find other focal point in Tre Esedre that can be organized in the focal point of the Great Thermal Bath. Again, a 90-degree triangle. And then these axes, the axis of the thermal bath and the fifth axis we saw before laying on this side, create a third rectangle, triangle, again with 90-degree angles. And the 90 degrees can be found here, 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 there, and so on. With so many organizations, there are numerous clear angles that can be used and reproposed all over the villa, mainly the 90 degrees and the 32 degrees, that are those ones, 1 and 2. Here again, you can see other 90 degrees angles, but you can see again 32 angles, 32 degrees angles, 90-degree angles, 90-degree angles, 90-degree angles. So now we can talk about, and we already start in understanding, Villa Adriana and its modernity. As you can see, until now, we are still speaking only about compositional systems. So a way that can help you in understanding how to manage the design process. Nothing to do with style. This has to be clear in your mind, because coming to Premio Piranesi, you're coming to understand the principle of the design process and the discipline. We are not going to speak about style. I mean, it could happen, but this is not the main point. What we want you to learn coming in Villa Adriana is how Villa Adriana could be used to produce contemporary architecture. You probably, since most of you are from foreign country, you probably don't know Giancarlo De Carlo. Giancarlo De Carlo was an architect from the last century, an Italian architect, very famous one in Europe, that designed a lot and settled very big settlements all over Italy, mainly, according to some very critical point of view. Let me tell you about some sentences. Giancarlo De Carlo used to say, the modern movement was unique and exclusive, while today is impossible to progress without multi-purpose and inclusive representation. Their construction is very difficult because it is always possible, in moments of weakness, to slip back into eclecticism. But in moments of lucidity, results of great overall significance can be achieved. Grazie. Scusa. The interviewer asked him if he could have given some examples. And Giancarlo answered, talking about how nowadays we can design in moments of lucidity, having great results. An example taken from the past is the masterful Villa Adriana in Tivoli, where the multiplicity of language is intrinsic to the compositional substance. The alignments, the dissonances, the variation, the repetition are subtle. The axes cross, spread apart, and reconnect with such naturalness as to be unable to distinguish whether their relationship derive from a precedent calculation or are stabilized by an aftermath combination. So the program is confused with the result, and this composition of the space becomes significant. I'm not sure that all of the architects who work with the Emperor Hadrian sought a multiple language, but it is possible because they live in a society full of tension and changes like ours, in an essentially non-EU society. So this paragon between the 2nd century and our days, it's pretty amazing. We have some keywords to understand how to work in Villa Adriana, but how to work even nowadays. Concept that can be assumed as never-ending. Those concepts are the concept of boundary. The concept is the central floor plan. The concept is the concept of the offset. The concept could be the one of that I told you about, hypotaxis, that is hierarchical relationship, or the concept of parataxis, that is scalene contact, that is something that is all on the same level. We have water architecture, the use of the asymmetry or ponderal symmetry, circular enclosure, something that could be conic, and something that has to do with syntactic elements, linear wall, and the concept of theater. All of those keywords that fit perfectly for Villa Adriana could fit perfectly even for contemporary architecture. For example, this is a very abstract and amazing model that has been done 60 years ago by Luigi Moretti signifies the relationship between three elements of Villa Adriana. You can clearly recognize the Maritime Theater, the circular element, the Sala of the Philosophers, that is the little cube, and the Pesile porticos, the linear element. The connection between those three elements is from Villa Adriana, but is one of the most modern way to connect elements one to each other. And those elements, those kind of connection, can be found even in architecture from completely different periods. For example, here you can see Vatican City and the settlements that is from the 16th century, so 1,500 years after Villa Adriana, are according to similar concepts. Even Raffaello, designing Villa Madama, used exactly the same concept of relationship between the elements, circular elements, axes, boundaries, asymmetry, ponderal symmetry, the theater, the presence of the theater. And even in later construction, this is Villa Caprarola with this completely incredible construction of a pentagonal element with a central courtyard in the middle, use the same connection, a theater and a central plan in the middle that organize in a hypotactical way all the other elements around, turning a shape that is rounded into one that is pentagonal. Or even Guarino Guarini. If you look at the plan on the bottom left image, that is the plan of the Piazza d'Oro pavilion, and you compare it to the plan from the Baroque period from Guarino Guarini in Turin, you can see how similar the plans are. But even if you come closer to our times and we move to Gardone, close to Garda Lake, you can see that in the Vittoriano of the Italians, the residence of an important Italian poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the construction of these settlements is according to exactly the same principles of Villa Adriana that I already explained you. Here you can see the enlarged image. And here you can see even a more complex organization of the elements. And if we come to the University College in Urbino, those designed by Giancarlo De Cardo, the one I read you the sentences from, you can clearly understand from this plan already how similar the organizational concepts are to the one of Villa Adriana. A theater, paratactical element, hypotactical axis, symmetry or ponderal symmetry, asymmetry, organization by axis, central focus point, that are exactly the same from Richard Meyer, when Richard Meyer in the 80s designed the Getty Center for Art in Los Angeles 40 years ago. As you can see from this plan, the organization of this complex that is 40 years old is exactly the same of Villa Adriana, that is 2000 years old. Again, the same elements, circular floor plan, axis, hypotaxis, parataxis, ponderal symmetry, the presence of the theater, and everything managed and organized according to exactly the same principles. So, if Richard Meyer 40 years ago could have used the same principle of Villa Adriana from 2000 years ago, probably we can assume that we can even use the same to produce our architecture. And here you can see very contemporary way of designing architecture using exactly the same principle I just tried to show you. Those are, again, the plans. In the higher part, you can see the elevation of the complex from Richard Meyer. And the same kind of structure that you can find in Villa Adriana with the parataxis and the scalene contacts can be found in the St. Andrew Priory from Louis Kahn from the 70s of the last century. Can't you see a closer relationship between the design from Louis Kahn and the design of Villa Adriana? Can't you see how similar they are? And at the end of the day, we can even ensure that there are strain connection. In fact, we know that Louis Kahn used to keep a plan of Villa Adriana always standing in his office because he wanted to get inspired by this amazing settlement. Even this complex from James Sterling in Berlin, that you can visit even nowadays if you go there, you can see some picture underneath, is clearly inspired by the same principle that you can find in Villa Adriana of contacting one to each other. And you can again find axes, you can find paratactical and hypotactical connection, the symmetry, ponderal symmetry and asymmetry still in there, and the presence of a theater, even in this way, and even of a stoa, exactly like in Villa Adriana, exactly like in the Acropolis of Athens, exactly like in the Acropolis of Pergamo, and exactly like the sanctuary of Isis in the Philae Island in Egypt. Those are some projects from Peter Eisenman, again, projects from the 80s and the 90s. And if you look to them closer, you will see clearly, again, the same principle that used to organize Villa Adriana. And Villa Adriana, being an Adrian settlement, keeps all the need, all the features of Adrian's architecture that are those of circular architecture. If we go back to the Manhattan Theater, a building that has almost 2,000 years of time, of life, this kind of settlement of having a circular boundary and an island in the middle can be found in other contemporary architecture all over the world. You can see this primary school in Piacenza from Vaccaro. You can see this project from Eduardo Sottodemonte, sorry, from Alberto Campobaeza of another primary school. You can see some element from all over the world, from Japan, from Germany. The same complex, the same idea of having a circular boundary and a central point, often characterized by water. And again, with James Sterling and the Neue Stadtgalerie in Stuttgart, you can see how Villa Adriana affected the design principles of those elements. You have a central circular floor plan, a theater, the parataxis, the hypotaxis, the scalene contact one to each other. And you can go there and visit in Stuttgart this complex still there that is clearly inspired by the same concepts of Villa Adriana. This is the primary school from nursery, not primary school, sorry, a nursery from Alberto Campobaeza with, again, a circular boundary and a kind of a core in the middle, exactly like the Maritime Theater. And here you can see the building erected, still there, even nowadays. And here you can see the plan. Isn't it closer to the Maritime Theater? The inspiration from classical architecture for contemporary architecture has always been a fundamental part of the design process. Here, in the central and in the right image, you can see the Pantheon. The Pantheon is a building in center of Rome, still from Hadrian period, while on the left image, you can see the Parliament of Dhaka from Louis Khan in the 70s. Can you see how closer those architectures are? A building from the 70s of the last century and a building from 2000 years ago, because Louis Khan used to inspire himself for the designing of the parliament in Dhaka to the Pantheon in Rome. But let me show you the last image, that is the design project still from Louis Kahn of a church in the United States. And you can see how this facade, this elevation of this church is clearly inspired by the ruins of the Pretorio, again in Villa Adriana. So, to me, it's pretty clear how the classical architecture from Villa Adriana and its principle can inspire the production of contemporary architecture nowadays. So, let's say that today's presentation finished, actually. I know that it's been quite complicated and quite tiring, but you don't have to be scared because of that. First of all, because we have the recording if you want to listen back. Second of all, because if you're going to join Premio Piranesi in August, September, we will be there and we will train you and try to teach you all day long in trying to make you understand better what I just tried to explain you today. Anyway, do you have any question to ask me? Probably you are tired, I know, because 1 hour listening to those deep concept is not that easy, mainly because we are not speaking our own language. So it's going to be very difficult and very tiring to be assumed. But if you have any kind of answer or any kind of question, please don't hesitate and ask me now. Your silence. Oh, yeah, chat. I've got something in the chat.